Order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest panel session of the Environmental Audit Committee. And this is the first session in our new study into data centres. I'm very pleased to say that we have two excellent panels in front of us today. I'm going to start by inviting our panellists simply to introduce themselves and their organisations and their very sort of most basic perspective on the need for data centres. So if I could start with yourself, Mr. Birtwistle.
Hello, thank you very much to the committee. My name is Michael Birtwistle. I'm Associate Director for Law and Policy at the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is a philanthropically funded independent research institute with a mission to make AI and data work for people and society. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Ms. Christopoulou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Christina Christopoulou. I'm a Senior Manager of Infrastructure, Energy and Environment Policy at Amazon Web Services for Europe, Middle East and Africa. And as part of my role, I engage with policymakers on energy, infrastructure and water dimensions of our data center operations. And meeting the demand we're seeing across our customer base sustainably is one of the key features of how we design and operate our infrastructure.
Excellent. And Mr. Stewart.
Good afternoon, Steve Stewart. Yeah, I'm the Senior Technical Advisor working for GCA, supporting the Crown Hosting Framework Authority, delivering that framework on behalf of the Cabinet Office.
You want just to explain what the Crown Hosting Framework is for those watching?
Absolutely. The Crown Hosting Framework basically allows public sector entities to buy data centre space through our supplier, ARC Data Centres, and we sit kind of in the middle between the Cabinet Office, the supplier and the customer to make sure that everyone does as they should do.
And so you are a government, a public sector body?
Yes.
Providing data centre services to the public sector?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, if I could start with you, Ms. Christopoulou, just to get to sort of brass tacks for the benefit of those watching. Feels like data centres is something that we've spoken about quite a bit, has entered the national lexicon, but I'm not sure necessarily that everyone quite understands what we're talking about. Is this just a sort of increased version of the old server room that was in every company from around the country, or something a bit more than that? Can you just give us a bit of a sense of what a data centre is and what the sort of range is of data centres from the sort of very largest to the smallest that could be considered a data centre when we're talking about this?
Absolutely. And let me start by saying that cloud computing is embedded in our everyday life. From the minute we swipe our card to make an online transaction, a hospital pulls out records from a patient, or a university sharing results of a final exam. All that data, all these transactions are happening in a physical building called a data center. So we're talking about computing devices hosting in a data center, hardware, software, but also networking equipment that is used to share the data across. From my perspective, of course, representing a cloud computing operator, there are different parts in the sector. So we're talking about on-premise data centers, so servers and rooms where companies are owning the server and are using the IT equipment on house. But then we're talking also about cloud service operators who are having the facility, so the infrastructure, and then they can serve the customers through the cloud, so the cloud computing feature that I just mentioned.
Can I interrupt just for a second? I'm so sorry, I'm partially deaf. Could you speak up a little bit more for me? I'm really struggling to hear you, and I want to hear everything that you're saying. Thank you.
Absolutely. You want me to repeat?
A bit, no, well, just loud. If you just louder
absolutely.
Going forwards, it'll make life a lot easier for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if we were to visit an Amazon data centre, just give people watching our proceedings here a sense of what they would actually see there.
So you would see the computing devices, as I've said. You would see the hardware, so our racks that we have within the data center that are used. So it's the power, the engine that is powering the IT services, which are within the building, so the facility. Of course, we also power these devices through electricity, but we also need to be meeting high security and resilience standards, for which we have backup power available to make sure that we can reliably service 24/7 customer demand.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, some people's fears about data centres in principle is this is effectively computers doing people out of work? To what extent are they providers of work, and to what extent are they sort of thieves of jobs from people?
I think it's important to look at the broader benefits that cloud and AI can bring, and maybe to tell you also a bit about our experience. So we announced an 8 billion investment in 2024, between 2024 and 2028, and we looked into the data and we saw that this investment in data center infrastructure can bring up to 40 billion of GDP contribution. So I think this is one of the figures from our own research. There's also third-party studies that were done in 2023 that saw that cloud computing at large can bring a benefit of 42 billion, which is a 1.6 value add to the GDP of the country. And just to bring it also into perspective, this was larger at that time than the UK automotive manufacturing industry.
Yeah.
So this is one of the areas.
And Mr. Stewart, I mean, just turning now to your own provision and thinking about the same sort of fundamental value questions, do you would the sort of environment that your business, your organisation is responsible for, largely in physical terms, mirror what you would see in the private sector, or are there any kind of key differences?
The key differences generally are, it certainly appears to be price. Whenever we've kind of weighed it up against industry offerings, we generally come out as a 50% benefit to the public sector. Likes of
why is that?
Scale. We buy, the Cabinet Office buys as bulk as such, so we get a good price. The data centres we utilise are all highly efficient, guaranteed a PUE of 1.15, so they're some of the best out there. It generally is just a good terms as well. We also have the ability for termination convenience, which generally don't get in industry offerings, just more flexible, which obviously public sector does require planning 7+ years in advance is difficult, shall we say.
Yeah, we'd love the public sector to be planning 7 years in advance in some areas, but that's good to hear in this regard. And I mean, just so I understand what you're talking about, you are effectively buying these services for the government from private providers. You aren't running them all yourselves? Or?
No, we literally offer the environment only. So you get the building, the power, communication, stuff like that. Everything else is down to the individual entity to put their equipment in and basically plug it in and then manage it themselves. Now they can employ a third-party provider to do that on their behalf if they so want, or larger scale ones, DWP for example, have their own engineers and stuff and they manage it in-house.
Yes. Okay, I mean, just on that sort of point of principle, before we move into some of the detail, Mr. Birtwistle, I mean, from your perspective, we heard about the sort of GDP growth potential offered by data centres. I mean, on a sort of point of principle, does your organisation have any views about the sort of charge towards public and private sector data centre usage?
I think what we would say is that building data centres on the scale that is envisioned involves large societal trade-offs, and it's very important for policymakers and decision makers to have good information about those trade-offs. And we are concerned that on both sides of the trade-off, in terms of, for example, the claims about productivity that are made, and in terms of the information that policymakers have about energy use, water usage and so on, are not accurate, and so it's very difficult to make good decisions in that information environment.
And I mean, obviously that's precisely what's sort of driven this study. We're right, as you're aware, right at the start of that. But what would be key things you would want this study to scrutinise to try and ensure we are better informed on these matters?
Yeah, so I could probably talk at length more about sort of concerns and barriers around the use of data centres later, but in short, on the sort of, if you like, claims about the benefits of data centres and of AI generally, it's London Tech Week. On Monday, I was there and watching all of the sort of main stage. The sorts of claims that are being made are very much driven by an intention to create a sort of fear of missing out. So one company said the next 18 months will determine how well the UK competes in the global economy. Another said the UK mustn't lose its head start, and it's sort of positioned as this being future productivity. We've published a report on the methodology that sits behind a lot of the productivity claims, particularly in the public sector, that essentially says there are recurrent faults in those methodologies that are potentially overestimating the benefits of those technologies. And then looking at the other side, in terms of the the other thing I should mention there briefly is jobs. We would like Parliament to take a view on, I suppose, where the benefit of those of the investment is actually accruing. You have one-off jobs that are created like constructions. You only need 50 to 100 people to run a full-scale data centre on a permanent basis. There are questionable statistics about the sort of the onward jobs that are created by data centres. And then on the other side, transparency around energy use, around water use, and around sort of pollution and other effects that can occur. I'll stop there.
No, that's helpful. I mean, I think it fits in with some of what we had set out in the first, in our initial terms of reference, but thank you. Jonathan Davies.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to sort of move us on a little bit in terms of why this is such an important growth sector. We know that demand for data centres is outstripping supply in the UK at the moment. I just wonder, there's probably a number of factors behind that, but perhaps if you could tell us what is leading that demand, that would be helpful. Perhaps if I start with you, Mr. Stewart, I don't know if you might be well placed to introduce this for us.
I can certainly comment on the public sector and what their demand looks like. From the spend for our framework, it's been relatively even, about 64 million last 2 years. But there has been a slight change in what customers are commenting on. They're now switching to the likes of, we've had engagement recently from a major education entity within the UK. They're looking at high-power compute and AI and wanting water cooling solutions. So that's kind of the route our suppliers are looking towards now. Sovereignty is another one that I'm sure has cropped up a number of times. A lot of customers are looking towards that, data sovereignty and having it based in the UK. I know that could be a wider topic for another day. But generally, the market is shifting slightly from traditional air-cooled data centres to wanting denser racks for AI and the like. It seems to be the trend we're certainly seeing in the public sector at the minute.
I wonder, thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Christopoulou, if you've got any reflections on it, perhaps from a more commercial private sector perspective.
Yep. So we're seeing demand growth across all our customer base, so public sector, private sector, financial institutions, and all sorts of businesses. We did a study earlier this year where we tried to look at AI adoption across UK organizations, and we saw that between 2025 to 2026 there was an increase in AI adoption from 52 to 64%, which was also, interestingly enough, 10% above EU average. There are also data available at the global stage, so in the International Energy Agency also looked into demand growth and saw that in the next 5 years, demand will double. It's important to contextualize. Demand will double from 1.5% to 3%. I think when we're talking about demand, it's important to see that there is general purpose compute, so the standard compute, but then we also have AI, and we see also a demand need that might be coming out for the standard shift to cloud. So if we look at today, 85% of the workloads are hosted on premise, meaning the servers that we discussed before, which are potentially in a basement or next to a small business. And when we look at that hosted capacity, which is on premise, we see that cloud is 4.1 times more efficient, so using less energy. So I think there is also a discussion here around where that demand and that growth should happen.
Did you want to add something, Mr. Birtwistle?
If I might, thank you. I think, in our view, there is one major technical reason that is driving demand, and that is the reason that we're talking about sort of data centers today, and that is the advent of general purpose AI. The type of workload that is being demanded of a data center is an order of magnitude larger and more complex than maintaining cloud services, web, that kind of stuff. So if you look at, for example, DCIT's projected figures by 2030, 6 gigawatts of power asked of the UK grid by 2030, that is a significant scaling up that is due to precisely the kind of work that the maths that you're doing on these things. And accordingly, the types of data centers that are being proposed now are much, much larger. They are a different beast to the kind that, for example, Ireland saw a growth in over the 2010s. And I think there's a sort of set of technical reasons there, but it's also helpful to sort of talk about the political and strategic reasons why that there is this growth. So you have the tech sovereignty debate, which another committee of this House sort of opined on earlier in the week, but essentially this idea that the UK is going to want its own sovereign AI compute. The UK AI hardware plan released earlier in the week said we face increasing concentration of supply, intensifying geopolitical competition, and growing vulnerability in the critical technologies that power modern economies. So that's the government's view. It's also a bit of a sort of strategic stake that the UK wants to have in the future AI economy. Minister Narayan put this in Feb as we need greater British technology ownership before we can demand deeper British technology influence. There is a bet being made about what kind of AI is going to be useful in future. The sort of the AI growth zones and the AI opportunities plan sort of assume a strategy of investment in frontier AI, general purpose systems, and a future of sort of agentic and multi-agentic systems. There is the desire to sort of reform and improve public services. The AI Opportunities Plan sort of envisions quite a lot of tie-in between public sector transformation and the investment in compute. And then sort of the desire to secure economic growth. Data centers are powering a large amount of the growth that the US is seeing at the moment and reporting, and some of that is imagined to be beneficial here. And the last reason is this sort of question of fear of missing out, a sense that one data center builder on Monday claimed that 8 billion investment in the UK that they're making to data centers will unlock 35 billion in productivity gains. Those are marketing claims, but they are materially affecting how UK policymakers are making the trade-offs that I talked about earlier.
Thank you. In terms of why the UK is a desirable destination for data centres, I was quite interested to see that many of the kind of limiting factors, whether that's grid connections, energy sourcing and using the waste heat, or sustainability, data protection, or financial incentives, the UK actually outperforms Germany and the Netherlands. I think that's correct. But I wonder if you might be able to perhaps, if again I start with you, Mr. Stewart, talk to us about what the limiting factors are in terms of this industry growing.
Difficult for me to say, really, from the public sector. Our growth is limited by the public sector's willingness to move, really. There's clear evidence that it is beneficial to move into our data centres, as has been shown by many customers. There is just not the desire by some to move. Unfortunately, we have no influence on that. That is down to individual entities. Our market is kind of stuck.
So as a commercially driven organisation, Ms. Christopoulou, what would make the UK more attractive to the people who back your organisation?
I think the figures I mentioned before, the 8 billion that we announced in terms of investment in 2024 up until 2028, are an evidence to our long-term commitment to the UK economy and growth. If there is one thing that I will discuss in terms of what is top of mind for a data center operator like AWS when we are expanding. It's of course to have a stable and sustainable grid connection, to be able to meet our customer demands, and to have available land and broadband and network connectivity. So these are factors we consider, but this is at a general level as to which are the conditions that we seek to find whenever we're making decisions about our investments.
And I think that just leads me on to my final question, which I'll direct to Mr. Birtwistle. I read with interest that there's been a planning decision in Slough about building a new data centre, which the local authority initially rejected. It was due to be in the Green Belt, but it's been overruled by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and I'm guessing the reason for that is because it's such a lucrative opportunity for the UK. I was talking with a colleague recently from elsewhere in the country, and we were discussing data centres and the economic opportunities that they offer the UK, and he said perhaps a little bit flippantly to me that he'd rather that they built an Asda because it would create more jobs for local people. Obviously the country benefits from AI financially. It makes our public services more effective and efficient, and it drives commercial opportunities, but how do we take people with us on that journey at a very local level?
There was a report launched last night in the Palace, called the UK AI Compass, which is a piece of public attitudes work that looks very closely at the range of public attitudes in the UK about AI. And a very powerful theme that comes out in that work and comes out in ADA's own public attitudes research is a sense of disempowerment among people. And a sense that AI is not being developed necessarily in their interests. Evidently, you may well have trade-offs between the national interest and the local interest in many cases. That is a feature of the planning system. But presently, I think it's very instructive to look at the examples of the US and the examples of Ireland and their experience with data centre constructions, which have been much more a feature of their political landscape than ours. And you are currently seeing organised resistance to the construction of data centres. You're seeing concerns about how both the literal environmental impact of those data centres and the sort of system costs of those that are being pushed onto consumers, for example, through higher energy prices, are affecting support for those data centres. I think having clear, transparent decision-making made on good data about those trade-offs and having a link between that data centre and the community, for example, through waste heat management, for example, through purchase agreements that involve that data centre investing in that local community in some way, which is being discussed, is a feature of some of the discussions that are occurring between some data centre bids and their areas, are ways of managing those trade-offs, making people feel included in that discussion, and making them trust that it will actually lead to some benefit for them.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring Sarah Gibson in and then we'll go to Simon.
Very quickly, and slightly picking up from what you just said, I want to ask Mr. Stewart a question, which is that having just had a data centre in my constituency given planning permission, which will be quite clearly used by the Crown data hosting, it's next to a large MOD site. And during that process, we were shocked at how little engagement they felt was necessary. And my question to you is that as a major client of these data centres, as a major client, you have an ability to influence how they work. Could you not use that influence to try and get them to do over and above what is absolutely the minimum requirement, which is all they have done in my constituency? and actually try and persuade them to do more waste heat management, to start looking at using systems for cooling such as earth tubes rather than using the highly expensive and energy inefficient systems that they're already using. There seemed to be absolutely no pressure on them whatsoever from the final user, who in my case will be yourselves.
Yes and no. Sorry, it being quite vague. So we are, if we're talking about our data centres, it'll be, we are roughly 18 to 20% of the business across government. What we represent, I'm not completely sure, and what's going into those data centres, I know which ones you're on about, will be a very small part. They could be completely purchased by a hyperscaler, and we won't have any footprint in there at the minute. Certainly there is no schedule for us to look at taking them over. So what influence we have over the supplier is minimal at best. Obviously it is currently a joint venture, but we're a 25% stakeholder in that joint venture, which means again minimal influence, but some influence. Should we engage more? I couldn't agree more. Why wouldn't we? In fact, I've come from a strategic meeting with the supplier this morning, and we had that discussion of how do we engage with the public and the public sector as well to convince them that Crown Hosting and our data centres are good for us all.
You won't convince them by just engaging with them further unless you actually show some tangible benefits and some really straightforward things such as waste heat management or use and various other community benefits. And it takes you back to thinking about when other countries built nuclear power stations and they had district heating systems, which we have never managed. But surely as a large user of these, you should be in a position to have some influence over what they are doing. And it seems worrying to me that even with a 25% stake, you still don't feel as if you have that influence.
Again, it's because we've got a minority stake, we have that ability to ask them to do stuff. The contract is written, the Cabinet Office has signed it, that's what we will operate till 2029. After that, there'll be maybe a framework free, we'll see. And that might give us more influence on new sites that are going to be for public sector use or not. We're kind of stuck with what the framework we've got today and the influence we've got today, which is evidently not enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No problems.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ros Savage.
Thank you very much, Chair. So maybe I can direct this question first to Ms. Christopoulou and then open it up to our other panellists. Thank you. So looking at the environmental impacts, follows on well from Sarah's question. What are the principal impacts, environmental impacts of data centres today, and which of those, be that water, carbon footprint, whatever, do you think are likely to grow the most rapidly in the years ahead?
So what I can talk about from my perspective is what we do as a company to make sure that we are not putting any burden on the environment. We have a very comprehensive sustainability strategy which is guided by our North Star goal to be net zero carbon by 2040. And I can walk you through water, carbon-free energy and energy efficiency in terms of what we do, and maybe I'll start with water. So when we talk about water, it's important to talk about why we use water. We use water to cool our servers. And in the UK, we don't rely on water 97% of the year. So we only use water 3% of the year, which is when we need it to cool down the outside air so that our servers can be more energy efficient. There is a commitment that we've made to be water positive by 2030. We're 53% on the way. And there is also a metric which is showcasing how efficiently an operator is using water, the so-called water usage effectiveness. And we have across our European operations a 0.04. Just to put this into context, the industry has taken goals through the Climate New Data Center Pact, and there the commitment is to meet 0.4 by 2030. So these are some of the features that we do on water. Whenever we go beyond our efficiency, we also try to replenish water. We have, with Rivers Trust, a collaboration where we will be giving back 800 million litres to the community to contribute to the River Kennet and also the River Thames in the Thames Basin. So we have a basin approach where we look into it. And beyond that, whenever possible, we want to use industrial reuse water, which is also an area where we're looking forward to see a framework potentially in the future where utilities will be incentivized to provide and make such industrial water available. Pivoting to carbon-free energy, we are Europe's and UK's largest corporate buyer of carbon-free energy, and globally we're one of the leading buyers. We, again, as I've said, net zero carbon by 2040 goal. We have 700 projects, over 40 gigawatts of capacity that we have contracted. In the UK, we have 40 projects, which is the equivalent of up to 850,000 UK households. And just to name two of these, one is in Moray West in Scotland, and the other one is in Corlecky Hill in Northern Ireland. So two projects where we are adding net new capacity into the UK grid, which is benefiting not only our data centres, but also businesses and public sector, etc. But everything comes to the point that we try to not use much energy. So the greenest electron is the one that we not use. This is one of the principles we abide by as a company. As I mentioned before, we've done a study which showcased that AWS data centers can be up to 4.1 times more efficient compared to on-premise data centers. There is a measure which is showcasing data center efficiency, PUE, so power usage effectiveness, and our PUE globally is 1.15, at the European level 1.11. And just to put it into context, the average of the industry is between 1.5 to 1.6. The new data center design that we announced
last... Just to interrupt quickly, yes. The 1.5 to 1.6, is that hyperscalers and private clouds?
The whole industry.
Okay.
Average industry. And our new data center design can meet up to a 1.08 of power usage effectiveness. We're not stopping here. We're recognizing that AI will need more power. This is why our new data center components are designed in a way that they can reduce mechanical energy by up to 46%. And we have also the newest generation of AI chips, so-called Trainium 3 chips, which have a 4 times greater energy efficiency and compute performance to support that compute per watt that is produced in a data center. We also operate under the context of a global energy management system, the so-called ISO 50001, which is centralizing and standardizing our approach to energy efficiency across our operations. Now, all of these things are important, but especially when we consider what cloud can actually bring in terms of efficiency. And I think there are two figures I would like to share from the IEA report, one in 2026 and one in 2025. So the IEA in April found that if scaled AI technologies across the energy sector have the ability to reduce energy use at 13.5 exajoules. This is the annual consumption of a country like Indonesia, and Indonesia has 280 million of inhabitants. This is one figure. And the second figure is from last year. The IEA estimated that if AI technologies, if not scaled more than what we have available today, are integrated across the energy sector, they can save CO2 reductions up to 3 times larger than the total data center emissions by that time in 2035. So I think when we're having this discussion, it's important to look at what data centers should be doing, as I've evidenced.
Can I just ask a question on that quickly? There's very seductive numbers coming out there, but just in very simple terms, how would that happen?
If the energy sector...
What is the AI going to deliver in order to create that?
For instance, it can deliver power optimization, make sure that if grid operators are using AI technologies, they can reduce faults in their system, they can be more energy efficient, they can create flexibility in the system by way of creating, for instance, specific tariffs, and they can shift demand so that they are more efficient. Power optimization, there are a lot of technologies if scaled across the energy sector, and the energy sector has different ranges where we've seen, and this is not our data, this is the data from the International Energy Agency.
It would be very interesting to see the assumptions that underpin those figures.
Yes.
If those are available for you to send through afterwards.
We're happy to share through written evidence.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up the question, see if Mr. Stewart or Mr. Birtwistle have got anything that they'd like to add on that.
Sure. Thank you. So I think that there are three major areas of, if you like, direct effect, which is power, water, and sort of direct pollution. I think just to address some of the some of the claims being made, the scale of the sort of pressure on the grid that is envisioned by the growth, which is I think a fourfold increase by 2030, which is only 5 years away, is such that even if a single data center developer has a net zero strategy, you push elastic demand that doesn't care about whether it's green or not into fossil fuels and other non-renewables. So the net effect on the UK's, for example, net zero targets is still damaging. A second thing that's helpful to think about is exactly when demand happens. Data centers, firstly, are not like other forms of energy grid consumer. They are often much more constantly on. The workloads are scheduled across them, so that if you're doing inference, that's kind of something that, so people running queries on AI, you need to be constantly available with low latency. If you're training a model, maybe you'll do it at night when the energy is cheaper, but that still effectively means that data center is constantly pulling on the grid. In terms of that, sort of those figures, like we only use water 3% of the year, it matters when that happens. So if that is happening at a time when that area is already experiencing water stress because of very high temperatures, which is exactly when everything might be getting hot, then you're going to be increasing water stress at a time of critical water stress for that area. Another thing that's worth sort of disambiguating is some of these figures like water positivity, water neutrality. Those often do not measure exactly what you think they're measuring. They when you hear claims in the US in particular about water neutrality, you have reports of communities saying this water is being taken from one place and being put back in the other and still being counted as water neutral. So it is not necessarily an accurate proxy of water stress avoided. And then I suppose the other thing that it'd be worth talking about is behaviour that happens sort of behind the grid, behind the meter rather, as it's called, which is in order to this is true across the industry. I'm not making any claims about any particular developer, but in order to serve the energy requirements and the ability to the sort of the delays of getting on the grid, many developers are countenancing private energy generation, often using natural gas, which obviously has sort of knock-on effects for the UK's net zero target. So that is all to say there's sort of all of those concerns, and then there is, I suppose, a separate concern, which is, will the protections that are supposed to kick in and consider all of those impacts actually kick in and bite? And there are a number of reasons from, for example, the Buckinghamshire data centre example, which the committee might be familiar with, that the sort of policy levers the government is pulling in order to make this stuff happen quickly means that some of those impacts are being skipped, or the sort of the information that policymakers are making those decisions on is not complete.
Very interesting, thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Not a lot to add, to be honest, but to back up what Christina said, the fact is data centres are built to be as efficient as possible. That's the way they make their money. It is an industry, they've bills to pay. We just piggyback off it, really. So I can only talk for our data centres, very similar to AWS. We don't use water very often, but you are right, inevitably when we need it, it's at that peak times when there isn't a lot. Much the same as you have a water put in your garden, guaranteed you want it more when it's hot, and there is no rain. it's inevitable. But they are investing, I can guarantee that certainly ARC are investing in rainwater harvesting to maximise the amount of water they can possibly store. So when those times are hard, they don't drain from the grid and affect residents. They are doing their best. Whether it's enough, who knows what weather's going to be next fortnight.
They're doing something, whether they're doing their best.
Well, I would say they are doing their best, because if they can reduce the amount of water they take from the grid, it increases profits. Every benefit they can get to put more pounds in their pocket, it sounds quite brutal, but they are a business. And that is the fact of the matter. They need to pay their bills as well. So the more effective and efficient they are, the better it is for them, better it is for them as well. For us, it is for them.
Can I just ask it on that? I mean, is there any, when you're negotiating with private data centres, is there any consideration as to which workloads require both the data sovereignty and the latency which would require you to be in the UK versus workloads which could be in environmentally much better locations? You have just come back from Canada, where they use hydropower for pretty much most of their power. Much of the country is very cold. So I'm just sort of thinking about how we place workloads more efficiently around the globe.
From a Crown hosting perspective, we have no movement on it at all. We kind of signed up to a single supplier for the next few years. So they were UK based only. They do have data centres now in Europe, but we have no customers that got any interest in putting their data into Europe. They're quite happy with it being in the UK. Could we? Yes. Would we have any demand? Possibly not. Who knows? If the price is right, you never know. If the data owner has no issues with putting it in overseas territory and taking the risk that incurs, then that is always possible.
Thank you.
Could I just ask another quick follow-up question on the water usage, or in fact two? I assume that the water that's used for cooling remains clean water. It's not like fracking where the water comes out polluted with lots of nasty chemicals. It's clean when it goes in and clean when it comes out. Is that right?
So what I can confirm is that we don't use any industrial chemicals. We take the water as it's being supplied by the water supplier, and then we use it for cooling purposes and discharge it afterwards.
Okay. And is there any possibility of using something else to cool the servers? Is it possible to have a waterless system?
So there are dry cooling or waterless cooling technologies. Whenever we are deploying a data center, there is a suite of technology choices, and we look at what's best from a water and energy nexus, so looking at both together and what we can achieve. As I've said before, in the UK, 97% of the year we don't rely on water, and I also want to highlight that we have a water positive goal, so we're giving more water back to the communities, and our program on replenishment is based at the watershed level, so the watersheds where we operate our data centers.
Thank you. Mr. Birtwistle.
Very quickly, something that's important to understand at the technology level is there is a direct trade-off between water usage and energy usage. If you're not using water, you're using something else to cool your systems. You're probably using air cooling. There are some experimental technologies where you sort of immerse it in the whole server in a non-conductive liquid, but those aren't, I think, at sort of developed at scale yet. So if someone is saying we're using less water, it probably means they're using more energy. The other thing I just wanted to point to is this sort of connection between efficiency and net usage. The more efficient, the power efficient it becomes to make an AI query, the cheaper it becomes. And there is a sort of theory called Jevons paradox, which the committee will be familiar with, which is as something becomes more efficient, actually net demand rises. So it is a good thing for data centers to be efficient, but we should not expect that greater efficiency to mean less demand on the system in terms of energy and water.
Thank you very much.
Well, what about wind cooling, Mr. Birtwistle? I mean, I've been made aware of some data centres that are positioned in areas that are particularly windy and therefore, have less of a demand for water. Is this something you're conscious of? Or?
I think there might have been an article this morning about a Chinese data centre that was perhaps using wind cooling. I'm not a technical expert on that technology. I think the thing I would say on it is, from what I understand, it is not in, if you like, mass-scale deployment yet. And the key question, as Christina put it, there is a suite of technologies that can be chosen from when a data centre is developed. The question we would raise is, what are the incentives to choose those different technologies, and are there sufficiently strong incentives to choose energy efficient, water efficient technologies?
And I mean, obviously that is something that both our report may recommend and government could at some point stipulate, couldn't they? Samuel Wilson.
Before I come to my question, could I just ask, this is out of pure personal ignorance in this, you've outlined the benefits of data centres in terms of productivity. I think the figure of £8 billion invested could give £35 billion worth of productivity gains, etc. How important, given the controversy that there is about, do they create a lot of jobs? Do they have impacts on local communities? How important is it to get those benefits, to have the data centres actually located here in the United Kingdom? Can they be geographically mobile, and can the benefits from them then still be experienced even if they were located in somewhere else?
That's directed to me.
Yeah.
So to be clear, I was referencing those productivity claims, but I think referring to them as claims with questionable methodologies behind them. I think the link between a data center being built in a location and the benefit of that data center being felt in that local area or even nationally is not automatic and needs to be designed for. And you can design for that with commercial incentives, requirements, using procurement levers to create a relationship between a data center and its area, or a data center and the kind of work that happens on that, or the efficiency of the work that needs to happen on that if you're concerned about environmental outcomes. But I think there is not a clear theory of change that says you plonk a data center down in some bit of the UK and that necessarily generates value for UK businesses. One sort of shorthand for that, for example, is when you see in a large announcement of a data center investment, probably about half of that is going straight out the door on chips. So it's not, unless those chips are being bought domestically, that benefit is not recirculating in the UK economy. And there were some messages in the AI hardware strategy earlier in the week that sort of suggested that the government may be beginning to prioritise the domestic value chain, which would be very positive if they were realised. But there is a tension between the geopolitical competition for having these data centres built in a particular location and the ability to insist on terms with the developers.
Anyone else wish to make a comment on that? Okay. I'll then move on to just the environmental sustainability of the centres. And the question I want to ask is, first of all, how are environmental sustainability practices embedded in both the planning and the operation of data centres? And can you give examples of where that has been done and how it's been done? Yes.
Yeah, if you're happy for me to talk. So I'm going to speak for our data centres. So our data centres are obviously designed and built in the UK. 95% of those materials for that are sourced from the UK to save on transportation costs and environmental impact. Like the concrete pour is reduced to minimum because of, obviously, again, the environmental impact that has. Steel is sourced from Wales. Everything that forms the carcass of the data centre is, as much as can be, is sourced from the UK to reduce that environmental impact. Inevitably, these are large buildings. I don't know if you've had the pleasure of visiting one, but I would encourage you. It's they're impressive. Please have a look. The structures are vast, and obviously there is an impact, as there is in building houses or anything else. But there are mechanisms to reduce that to the minimum that has to be.
Yeah, happy to build on the points that I made before. So I spoke before about water, energy, and carbon-free energy, which are three of the areas that, of course, always are top of mind whenever we are planning, building, and designing a data center. I can talk to a few other areas around operational sustainability. So, of course, whenever we are planning to develop a data center, we're trying to be a good citizen. We engage proactively with the community to understand the needs, to make sure that there is ongoing feedback about how we can be a good citizen and neighbor in that community. So, for instance, just to give you a couple of examples on noise, there are design features like acoustic enclosures, low noise equipment, and we're not managing these issues afterwards. We have it in the DNA of our design, and there are also planning boundaries, periodic monitoring, and there are ongoing compliance checks. Biodiversity as a next area, we follow a mitigation hierarchy when it comes to biodiversity, so avoid, minimize, restore biodiversity impacts, and this applies across all our UK facilities. We are also compliant with Environment Act from 2021 to achieve a 10% of biodiversity net gain, and whenever feasible, and there is also a viable grid connection because we need to meet customer demand, we are also building data centers on brownfield sites, and we're trying to make sure that we're adding value to that site and that area. Circularity is maybe another area, broadly speaking, that we're focusing on. So we have design principles: reuse, repair, and recycle. Design for as long use as possible, repair and then recycle. We have a European facility to recycle, to test and repair equipment and then recycle in Dublin. And recently we diverted 23.5 million components from landfill. So they were either resold in the secondary market or recycled. So there are a series of actions that we try to undertake, and of course our responsibility doesn't stop there. We're also trying to make sure that we're building a next generation of data center professionals that can find a job in our community. Just to give you one example, we created last year the UK's first data center apprenticeship, where the next generation of new people can actually learn what it means to be working in the data center operations. And we also committed to training 100,000 people in AI skills by 2030.
Thank you. So I suppose it might be useful to look at the example of Buckinghamshire here. The government has AI Growth Zone initiative. Part of that initiative, as established in the AI Opportunities Plan, is to help fast-track data centre proposals through things like environmental impact assessments, through habitat planning. And in that example, the government called a decision in and then admitted I think, serious, forgetting the exact quote now, but a serious logical misjudgment in the assumption that no environmental impact assessment was required. What that means in practice is that decision makers are not necessarily asking for or being given or have access to the detailed environmental information that they will need in order to make good decisions about those data centres. And then there's that sort of individual planning level decision, but there is also the sort of system level question. It was reported about a month back, I think in The Guardian, that there were serious disparities between DSIT's estimations of future energy demand and DESNZ's. And what good planning would look like at the system level is all bits of government having a single accurate picture of projected demand on the system based on real world proposals that are going through, not simply, say, the local authority doing that or the minister looking at a single called in planning decision.
You've outlined, as far as the building and the operation of the data centres, how you try to build in sustainability. Can I just take you to the point before you ever reach that decision? And it's really provoked by something which was a visit I had during the recess, where for data centre, obviously governments and authorities are keen to locate these data centres for all the reasons that you've given. And sometimes in doing that, maybe the sustainability or indeed the environmental impacts are not thought through totally. I'm thinking of one where there's currently a planning proposal for a wind farm in the Sperrins in the west of Northern Ireland. Beautiful, untouched upland, peat bog. The area itself is an area of natural beauty, etc. The wind farm will be designed to drive the power for data centres proposed in the northwest of Northern Ireland, and there's a big economic demand for them, etc. It will involve quite a lot of disruption to actually transfer the power once it's been generated to where the data centres would be. It will involve 250,000 metric tonnes of peat being removed from pristine bog. Now, see, when it comes to making an application, the authorities may well say to you, we'll provide electricity. Do the data centre providers, in their desire for sustainability, ever ask the questions behind that? Not just that, yes, you can provide the power for us, but how is that power going to be provided? What are the environmental implications of that going to be, and the social implications of that going to be, in terms of the power which we will require to locate in that particular locality? I mean, you may argue that that's the responsibility of the authorities who are going to give the planning permissions, etc. But do you ever ask those questions? What, even if the authorities are happy for us to come here, what are the consequences of our locating at this and making demands for either power or water? Yeah. Yes, good.
So as I've said before we invest in a new location, we always seek to be a good citizen and a good neighbor. We engage with the communities to understand their needs and demands. We have a very comprehensive sustainability strategy. We're trying to not add any burden from an environmental perspective, but ultimately we are meeting also customer demand, evidenced by the figures that I've shared before with this committee. So this is what I can say to that question.
But if the power is being supplied, if the authorities say, yeah, we can generate the power, you don't really ask if it's renewable, you don't ask what the implications of providing that renewable energy may have been, because that's not a decision for you, that's simply, are we getting renewable energy? Is that what you're saying?
So we are grid connected, but as I've said before, we have invested in the UK with over 40 projects, which is an equivalent of 964 megawatts. We're adding net new additional carbon-free energy through wind and solar to the UK grid, which is the contribution that we're making.
Yeah, would you expect, or all any of the three of you, would you expect that it's reasonable to dig in behind the implications of locating in a particular area to look at those kind of environmental issues and the impact which it may have on local communities who will not probably benefit from the data centre, but nevertheless are impacted?
I mean, on that case, I mean, I would expect the data centre would be interested in knowing where that power is coming from. If it's wind farm, it's obviously not a guarantee, so I'm sure it wouldn't be ideal for them anyway. So I'm sure they wouldn't be. I'd be surprised if they were pushing for that solution. It sounds like, and this is a world according to Steve, not anyone else, it sounds like a really bad idea. But I don't know the full story, obviously. But for a data centre, wind is not a guarantee. So it's, I'm sure they'd rather have a other renewable source. Yeah, and they would take that into account, I would hope.
But data centres do tell us that 50% of their energy at present is from renewable sources, which is not guaranteed. simply because the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So, and this does raise one of the issues of sustainability. What backup systems then are used? I mean, for example, would data centres rely on diesel generators in the case of an outage or whatever? And how is that regarded as sustainable provision of power?
So I can talk about this one. So our data centres operate 2 power streams, 2 backup generators, not diesel, they run on HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oil, so it runs far cleaner, far better for the environment. But they're only required if our mains power drops off, our multiple feeds for mains power. Could it happen? Yes, absolutely. And we do need to run those generators up to make sure they're operating as they're expected, so they're highly resilient to make sure that your laptop stays operating and gathering the data you require. So there is an impact, but it is minimised as much as possible. But back to that mains power, that is not a data centre operator, but I would say that decision would be questionable.
But given the increasing reliance on renewable power, which data centres boast about, would it be common to have those kinds of methods of backup, and how sustainable is that?
I mean, I can build on that. We have a plan to transition from fossil diesel to HVO. So hydrotreated vegetable oils, it was said, it's a renewable fuel from waste cooking, oil and vegetable oils. It can reduce up to 90% greenhouse gas emissions over the life cycle versus fossil diesel. We have started to do this already in 2023, and Ireland and Sweden started, and we have also started rolling out HVO at certain UK sites. Of course, there is a broader element here which is important, which is the sustainable procurement of HVO. So we're also making sure that raw materials are traceable to their origin, they're not derived from high biodiversity sources, and making sure that there's a sustainable supply chain is something that we are trying to support through the engagement that we have with suppliers.
Very quickly, I mean, I think that I think fundamentally at the bottom of the question was something about incentives, and there isn't an effective commercial or legal incentive for a company to take those things into account when they're being reassured that power will be there outside of the security of that power supply and its reliability, and other than passing their environmental impact assessment, which may be a process that they are that is sort of being completed through a fast-track process, to put it generously. And then I think that the wider question is there is a lack of alignment on the incentives or the ownership for outcomes that is held across other bits of the public sector. So the local authority, the grid, the sort of national planning in DESNES, in DCIT, in Treasury for the productivity gains. There isn't really a vehicle for alignment across all of those things to understand where benefit is going to be generated and whether or not it's the right trade-off to make. One sort of strange place in which that lack of alignments, incentives, plannings manifests is that there's currently a disconnection between the sort of priority you get in the grid queue and who can apply for that, and land ownership and planning permission. So you have situations in which some developers are sitting on land that is good for a data centre, and a different developer is ahead of them in the queue for a grid connection for that land that they don't own, which again shows you this sort of misalignment of incentives, and it's very difficult to plan for good societal and local level outcomes with those disconnections happening.
And just finally, in an attempt to reduce energy consumption in the longer run and be more sustainable, what is the potential for data storage cleanups and helping, a lot of data which is maybe held which is no longer of any use? Is there big potential there to reduce the power consumption that data centres would have, and is there any incentive to do so?
Yes, so for the public sector there certainly is. Now whether or not that in the entire trend, whether that will show a reduction, it will show a reduction over time, but you might not, it will always increase, I think, because technology is key to modern life, unfortunately. I think that's inevitable. It's not going to slow down in the near future. But you're right, we've seen public entities move into our facilities, they mature their data, chop a lot of it because there's always duplication, I'm sure we've all seen it. They make it right and then move it into the cloud. And that has shown a significant reduction in the data storage. Not everyone does it, unfortunately, or not everyone has done it, unfortunately. It could happen with a push, and it would then reduce, certainly in the public sector, the data storage requirements, and therefore their footprint in data centres.
Yeah, just to clarify the question, did you ask about data storage or on-site storage?
Data storage, yeah. Data storage.
I'm sorry, this is outside of my area of expertise.
I would defer to Steen on this, but I would assume that the compute and power costs of data storage, while it's right that people should push for efficiency there, are likely to be dwarfed by the compute costs of running AI training and inference. It's just a magnitude of order different workload.
Thank you very much. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. So just looking at growth of data centres, two sort of key things I want to cover. Firstly, why do estimates for the number of jobs created by data centres range quite as much as they do? And can each of you provide clarity on the figures that you're able to provide? And the second thing I was also quite interested in is the differences between public sector and commercial growth pressures. What are going to be the different constraints in those two sectors? Who wants to start? Steen, why don't you kick us off?
Why not? So on the employment issue, I struggle to comment because I don't run a data centre. I can only comment on what I've seen. I visit our two free sites, and there are a lot of people working there. There's cleaning staff, security staff. There is an environment there that requires people and jobs, some very skilled jobs as well. So there is employment. Whether or not it competes to I think someone says a NASDA or something like that earlier, I'm not sure, but it certainly is an employer in that community, and there are some highly skilled jobs that the UK requires. What that demand looks like, though, difficult. From the public sector, it has been constant for us at the minute, but it's all dependent. And again, this is only for our framework, it's very dependent on the government's drive at the time. When the Crown hosting was brought into place, there was a big push, cloud first policy and all that good stuff. We were named in that. There was a drive, and there was a big take up, and the trend towards us climbed massively. That has, I wouldn't say died off, it's just plateaued a little. Yet when we look at the data that the likes of DEFRA gather, questionable whether or not it's right, not DEFRA's fault, they're given information by other entities. There's a lot of public sector entities that have got those broom cupboard data centres that are highly inefficient, they're burning power like there isn't a requirement to. If they were to move into a highly efficient data centre that are offered by multiple people, there would be a vast saving on efficiency, power costs, carbon, water usage, and all that good stuff. But we're driven by, I guess, yourselves. If you push it, entities do come to us, and we can make things better, hopefully.
I suppose one of the things I've heard from all three of you, though, is the massive exponential increase in compute power that's needed as a result of AI versus the way that we were using using compute previously. is that built into your expectations, or have you had to? I mean, I'm guessing that your contract with ARC was signed at a time when AI was nascent, and you're now having to adapt massively to that.
And it is. I mean, the advantage we've got is obviously our supplier has to adapt to stay current. So they are adapting to support these type of technologies, and we can house them through our framework. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But hopefully when we rewrite it again, it'll be even better. We're kind of stuck with what we've got because, as I'm sure you appreciate, the framework's regenerated every so many years. It doesn't really move. It's set. We work with it for a number of years. It's set.
I'm conscious of time, so I suspect I can't see him all the time, but I suspect the chair is chivvying me a little bit.
So we're kind of stuck. We're limited by our framework. But I'm sure the private sector's different.
Thank you. Christina, do you want to build on the point about the difference between private and public sector, and then talk about the jobs point as well? That would be really helpful.
I can talk from the AWS perspective. I'm afraid I can't comment on public sector data centers. So we are serving a wide range of customers, public sector, commercial sector. We're seeing the demand growth as evidence, but also the opportunity, as a lot of today's cloud computing is still on-premise. We're servicing customers like the NHS, Department of Work and Pensions, Octopus, Sainsbury's, AstraZeneca, just to give you a couple of names. Now you asked a question about jobs. I think there are 3 layers we need to look at. One is construction, so jobs in the thousands. Then we have data center operations in the hundreds, very high skilled, permanent, safe jobs. But then the more important part is the study that I mentioned before, at least that we have conducted, which talked about the 14 billion GDP contribution, also saw that this can add up to 14,000 permanent roles into the UK economy, which we're supporting through measures that I've mentioned before, like the data center apprenticeship program, training young professionals to make sure they're equipped for the new and modern work market, to make sure that we have the right skills that are needed.
If you haven't already, it'd be really helpful if you could share that report.
We'll provide it with evidence.
Thank you. I suppose one of the things that I suspect my colleagues and I certainly would love to know is, within obviously a local local community in having a data centre nearby potentially runs the risk of there not being a local job uplift. Do you have anything to add on that? Are there any specific roles within the existing within the data center itself that you think you should be highlighting?
I mentioned the data center operational jobs, so engineers, for instance, security staff. But then, if you need more information, I'm happy to provide through written evidence. Thank you.
And Michael, finally.
Thank you. So I suppose I'd point in 2 places on the question of jobs and growth. As I said before, there's a bunch of construction jobs, significant but temporary. 50 to 100 people for your average data center to actually run it on a permanent basis, often quite highly skilled, so may or may not be sort of sourced locally. And then a lot of, I think they were referred to as imputed jobs, so imputed or inferred jobs, so what happens further down the value chain, the data center existing lets you sort of create. I think what I would encourage the committee to test is the assumptions that sit under those. They often use sort of fairly simplistic calculations, multipliers, that essentially say, we're going to guess this is going to create 6 times as many jobs as the data center runs. And that is the number worth probably pressing on. Secondly, just to describe a little bit about, you were asking about sort of AI in public services, and sort of what's driving sort of demand and use there and growth. It's worth distinguishing between narrow AI and general purpose AI. So narrow AI is something that looks at cancer scans. It's very, very specialized. It does not use, it uses an order of magnitude less compute than speaking to a chatbot. That is often the type of benefit that you see talked about, but it is sort of not what's driving the big system demand here. There's quite a lot of, if you like, the strategy to date has been across central government, give everyone a chatbot and see if they can become more productive. And then you have some organic adoption, if you like, at the coalface. So you have ambient voice translation is very popular with doctors at the moment and is sort of seeing wide uptake across the NHS. That again is narrow AI. It's a small model. And then you sort of see this sort of frontier of system transformation. So in the NHS, for example, they're very actively looking at whether they can build in agents, multi-agent systems into the way the NHS works and whether that can improve how the system works. That does involve polling effectively a large language model to say, okay, we've had this text in, what does it mean? What's the response? That does create that kind of system load. And so as the sort of the front line of public services starts and the stuff that happens behind the scenes starts to adopt agentic in particular, you can expect to see that demand go up and that dependence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, Mr. Birtwistle, Ms. Christopoulou and Mr. Steen, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. We'll bring this first panel to a close and switch over to the second panel. So the sitting is suspended. Order. Order. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the second of our opening session on the issue of data centres. I'm very pleased to welcome our panel. Could I start with yourself, Mr. Hayes, and invite the three of you to introduce yourselves, your organisations, and your particular interest with regard to data centres?
Hi, I'm Oliver Hayes. I'm Head of Policy and Campaigns at Global Action Plan. We're an environment charity established for 35 years here in the UK, and for the last couple of years we've been looking at the environmental impact of data centres.
Excellent. Well, you've come to the right place then. Dame Childs.
Dawn Childs. I'm a non-exec director at Pure Data Centres Group, and they build and operate hyperscale data centres globally for key hyperscale customers. We also have a climate tech arm called A Healthier Earth, which looks at the decarbonisation of data centres. I'm also the CEO of Enlighten, and that runs a portfolio of 34 edge data centres pan-Europe, and with my third hat on, I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and I'm a member of their National Engineering Policy Centre's AI Sustainability Working Group, and we've developed a report last year for the Foundations for Environmentally Sustainable AI, and also the follow-on work in support of the AI Energy Council and drive for wider sustainable adoption of AI.
Goodness, well, we were very lucky to find a space in your diary by the sound of it. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Chair, and it's great to be here this afternoon. My name is Matthew Evans. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Tech UK. We're the trade association for the UK tech sector, represent over 1,200 companies, and we have a mission to ensure that tech delivers benefits for people, society, economy and the planet. Of particular note today, we represent the vast majority of UK data centre operators in their various different forms, as well as many of the SMEs and institutions from life sciences and financial services sector that make use of those services as well.
Mr. Evans, we'll start with you. What are the trade-offs between reducing energy use and reducing water use, as we heard of in the first panel, and still maintaining the operational continuity of data centres?
Thanks. So I think sort of first of all it's worth making the point that the sector, both itself and its end customers, are absolutely committed to sustainable data centre build and operation. And there are, as you heard on the first panel, a number of trade-offs when it comes to these areas, but there are also importantly a number of mitigations I think that it's important to bear in mind. So there is loosely a trade-off between water and energy use. That is actually narrowing over time, particularly as we get to more advanced cooling technologies, but there is that trade-off, and certainly in some areas it makes sense maybe to use more water. You might guess from the accent that I'm from one of those areas that it may sometimes make sense to use water if there's an energy challenge with grid connection. But broadly we are moving away from water as a form of cooling. Data centres are energy intensive, but that has benefits as well as challenges. Industrial energy demand in the UK is actually falling and has been for a number of years. Obviously, as the grid itself is changing and is decentralising as we move to a renewable future, that brings grid costs, and with industrial demand falling, a lot of those grid costs could start to accrue to individual households. So actually, as data centres bring demand to the grid, they can potentially offset some of those grid costs by ultimately paying for them. And they also, as you heard from the first panel, underpin a lot of renewable energy generation. So there's one example of I believe it's the West Moray wind farm off the coast of Scotland, came online last year. It's an 800 megawatt renewable farm, and about 60% of that is underpinned by power purchase agreements to the data centre sector. So bringing additional resource to the grid. I think I'll leave it there for sort of opening remarks, but happy to go into any of that detail as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, bringing you, Mr. Hayes, I mean, you heard that kind of claim that effectively there can be advantages to the environment of data centres. What do you make of that?
I think it's extremely important to look at this in the round and economy-wide. We've seen escalating estimates of how much demand data centres are bringing. Almost every couple of months there's a new estimate, and NESO, the energy system operator, put out some figures in 2022 just ahead of the kind of boom in generative AI as to total energy demand they expected from data centres out to 2050. And when they revised those figures 3 years later, it had doubled. And that figure that they put out now looks like the equivalent of the entire commercial sector today, roughly a quarter of the entire electricity that the UK currently uses. And as has been mentioned already on in the previous panel, we have quite worrying discrepancy in terms of figures coming out of government. And earlier this year, Ofgem asked for people seeking a grid connection to come forward, and 140 data centres came forward, and that equated to 50 gigawatts of demand, which is slightly more than the entire UK demand on the peak winter day this year. And then in evidence to this committee, the government, DESNZ have said that figure might actually be 50 to 70 gigawatts, i.e. an additional 40%. And these are enormous figures. And we know that the government faces a big challenge already in electrifying heating and transport in order that we can decarbonise our economy. And doing that is going to require a doubling of electricity. So the idea that we can load on another doubling of electricity without there being fossil fuel generation going into the mix seems very far-fetched to us. The reality is that the pace of data centre growth is far outstripping the pace of renewables deployment, and that means that we will stimulate more fossil fuel generation. And the final thing I'd add is...
If I just stop you for a second there, and we come on to your other point, I think it's a very interesting, important point, because, of course, we already had huge demands for energy. We want to see renewable sources being used to service those demands for energy. But if, in terms of your original answer, Mr. Evans, you're sort of saying, well, we've got this wind farm and we can give them 60% of the business, but the wind farm's only an advantage if it's replacing fossil fuels. If actually we're having to build renewables in order to service data centres, then we've lost the initial benefit that the renewables might have produced in terms of replacing fossil fuels. And if, as Mr. Hayes says, actually the growth of data centres is outstripping the growth of renewables, then not only is the sector likely to be utilising all of that energy that might otherwise be replacing fossil fuels, but it's actually got additional demands on top. So, do you not accept that the sort of scale of energy usage really places huge demands on the sector to look to reduce to be more efficient, to reduce its energy and water consumption?
So the simplest demand on the sector to reduce, to be more efficient, particularly in power, but also in water, is the price of energy. We have as I'm sure you're aware, one of the highest commercial, industrial cost of energy in the G7, and I think well above the cost across the IEA. And to give you sort of a sense of what that looks like, to run 100 megawatt data centre in the UK is probably about 4 times as expensive as it is to run one in the US. So really sort of significant driver, and that is the greatest commercial driver for efficiency in the UK. I think just touching on some of those headline figures, because there are some I will say this, laughable figures out there in terms of the demand for data centre build in the UK. So the 50 to sort of 75 gigawatt. There are definitely some speculative and a lot of speculative demands at the moment in the grid connection queue system. Some of that is an unintended consequence that we've seen from policies like AI growth zones, unfortunately. But there is also a lot of land banking going on from developers who are not well established in the UK. And we are working with Ofgem to look at how we put a couple more gates in place for that grid connection. And just to give you an example of what 50...
Do you think that 50 to 70...
To give you an example of what that might cost in power terms annually, it would be about £75 billion a year just to power that on sort of an 80% load rate, right? So I'm not even taking 100% load rate there. You know, that is the defence budget. Now, we might have a separate argument of whether the defence budget is high enough these days, but, you know, that is the sort of level that would be. And there is no demand from that in terms of the current market situation in the UK. You know, at the moment, we're at the sort of 1.5 to, you know, moving towards 3 gigawatt in terms of what the market is. I should say as well, we're actually really good at this. We have been a leading data centre market across Europe and globally because of our expertise in how we build and run data centres, and that is a lot to do in terms of the efficiency that we have as well.
Yeah, so that sort of answered, I think, the next question I was going to ask, that despite the energy costs, because of that sort of intellectual property and expertise, Britain is still seen as an attractive place to do this.
And we've got the customers here. You know, we've got the financial services sector, we've got the life sciences sector, we've got increasingly the public sector as well, and others who have really stimulated and provided that demand. And, you know, ultimately data centres are there to service the end customer.
Yeah, Dame Charles, can I ask you, what specific metrics do you think should be reported to make statutory reporting meaningful for assessing resource needs?
And so I think everybody focuses on power usage effectiveness, and I think that kind of misses the point slightly, because to Mr. Evans' point, we are very good at building. Thank you. We're very good at building and operating data centres in the UK, and so PUE is generally very good. And our customers, if I think from a pure perspective, our customers demand the best PUE. So of course, power usage effectiveness.
Okay, great.
And so effectively what you're looking at is you're comparing the power to power the compute, so working the chips and that power consumption around the power to operate the building, so the cooling effectively and management of the data center. And so that's the ratio. The one is the compute, and the 0.2 up to however far you go is the power to run the building. And we can all, particularly for new data centers, and let's face it, we're focusing on new data centers because the legacy data centers are already built, right? So you're not really changing them anytime soon. So for new data centers, of course you can demand a good PUE, and all of the hyperscale customers would already demand that of us. The focus should really be on the one, so the power to compute, and the advances in the last decade have significantly improved that. So we're already seeing 10 times more efficient compute, and every single chip designer is working on improving that power efficiency yet again. So you will see improvements in designs from silicon onto photonics. That there are new sort of ways of overlaying logic, which means that this power consumption will go down. And so I think, of course, you can measure PUE. You can measure water usage effectiveness. And at Pure, for example, we operate closed-loop systems. So we never use adiabatic cooling. So for all of our new data centers going forward, there is no running water. So of course you can measure WUE, but I don't think that's necessarily a requirement for modern data centers.
If I just stop you for a second there, because I think we're hitting upon something that's really of interest to this committee, which is that if it is the case that the sort of level of potential demand is far greater than the level of demand that is actually likely to be delivered, and there are all kinds of sort of technological wizardry that can reduce the environmental footprint of these data centres. What should government be expecting of data centres? If we're saying the government doesn't just have to accept whatever anyone offers, so they can make sure that we only get the most environmentally friendly, that we only get those data centres that are going to make contributions to the grid, for example, or to recycling the water. What sort of reasonable expectations do you think the government should have of the sector to ensure that it minimises the detriments and maximises the benefits?
And so I think any good data center operator will always be thinking about the environmental benefits and community benefits of the data centers they're building. So if I look at, for example, our scheme in Brent for Pure Data Centers Group, we worked very closely with the local community to ensure that the facility we were putting up actually added to the community. So from a biodiversity perspective, that building is going to be enrobed in one of the largest living walls in the world to have the impact of taking and absorbing pollutants out of one of the most polluted parts of the country, where somebody had pollution as the cause of death. So actually, from a community perspective, it's really additional to the community. So I think we should expect developers to be very ethical and very considerate in the way they develop. But let's be clear, we won't be getting, I don't think, massive data centres built in the UK because all of my customers are only looking at growing organically in the UK, so for the compute demands that are needed for the customers that are already here, so the banking sector and so on. So organic growth is required, but large-scale AI data centres will not be built because it's too expensive. The power of compute, to pick up on the example that Matt was using, for a 100 megawatt data centre, operationally for the cost of power, it's £250 million more a year to operate it here. So my customers want me to build with Pure Data Centres those facilities in the Nordics, for example, where the cost of power is much cheaper. So although there might be a very backed up system of applications, the majority of those are speculative, and I don't believe that any of my customers would want those built here because the facilities would be too expensive to run, and also they're too far away from a planning and consenting and access to power perspective. So I think we can be as demanding as we choose to be, but the reality is that then those data centres won't be built here unless that's for organic growth. So we need to measure up what it is we're seeking, and be sure that we're asking for the right things to be built. If it's
so I think, I hear what you said. We've had somewhat, I think, conflicting evidence there, because a minute ago we were hearing about the great attractiveness of the UK, and now you say, well, no one's going to build one here except for organic growth. I think that I absolutely hear what you say, that a good provider might be doing many of these things anyway, but we all know in this place that we end up hearing about the bad providers. They're the ones that end up coming on our on our doorstep. So I guess I'll just return sort of slightly more specifically to my original question, which is, if we are going to get to the end of this inquiry, make recommendations to government in terms of what we might see here, and balancing the environmental demands with the need for the UK to be an attractive business environment, and also taking on board everything that you and Mr. Evans have said about the potential for the next generation of data centres. What sort of things can government put in place to offer reassurance that we can have some of the data centre growth that your sector advocates, without the worst fears of people on the environmental damage that will cause coming true?
And so PUE, so power usage effectiveness, water usage effectiveness, use of waste heat, but may I just say that all of our data centres are already ready to give away waste heat. There's nowhere to give it to, though. So when I build in other jurisdictions, the waste heat networks are there to plug into, so that waste heat is immediately used. In the UK, already the manifolds are there for the waste heat to be reused, but there's no network to plug into. So
is that a planning thing, or is that a network thing?
So it's not planning, it's a network, and it's more sort of systems thinking. So effectively, if I take the Brent data centre example, we're waiting on a housing scheme to be built, which is sometime in the future, before there's a sufficient business case for the provider of the heat network to be able to put that scheme together. So we're sitting ready and waiting, and the data centre has been operational for multiple years, but that heat reuse has not been put into effect.
Sorry, Dawn. If I can just come in, that is a good example of where you've seen heat offtake in particular work for district heating. It is often in a sort of whole site development area, so Old Oak, Park Royal area, the Olympic Park. These are good examples of where actually the data centre and housing and the district heat network were being built concurrently, and therefore there are good incentives and often a local coordinating body to make sure that those benefits were spread across the piece. It can be very hard to try and line those up sort of on a purely commercial basis, because timelines and other things will run differently for each of those.
And Mr. Hayes, what do you say to this evidence we just heard, that actually, the sort of scale of data centre growth has been hugely exaggerated, and that actually, we can't take the speculative queue as any kind of sign as to what's actually likely to be built?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Ofgem looked at that 50 gigawatts, and they said that of that, 20 had final investment decisions in place. They had the financing good to go. And I'm sure there will be significant chunks of that 50 that don't end up getting built, but I do slightly challenge the idea that there aren't going to be any big data centres here. And we see that in particular planning applications as well. So we've just had a very short and some would argue slightly anti-democratic consultation with the Havering data centre out in East London, which is a 600 megawatt site, very advanced in its planning, and it's being pushed through with a local development order. We know, we were involved, as you know, in the data centre that's been referenced already in Buckinghamshire. That's a 90 megawatt data centre that's coming through. We've got 1 gigawatt data centres in planning, both in Elsham Park in Lincolnshire and in Blythe. And 1 gigawatt is 2 million homes worth of power. It's the size of a nuclear power station's output. So
to stop you on before you move on, because I think it's really interesting just to put to Dame Charles, when you hear about those kind of proposals, is that what you consider to be sort of fairly small data centres, or would you acknowledge that sort of 1 gigawatt data centres are major data centres?
Of course they're major data centres, but from my perspective, working with my investors, we would never build that speculatively. So I guess my question is, who is the end customer? And so will that definitely go forward? Because as we've already seen, there have been some fantastic announcements, and then there have been some step backs from those announcements. So the reality of investing that money and putting it in the ground, it's two very different things.
Did you want to just finish what you were saying there, Mr. Hayes, or shall I move on?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the final thing I wanted to add is that clearly the grid connection and the grid queue is a problem for developers, and understandably developers want to build as quickly as they can. But that unfortunately is leading to inquiries about powering data centres with gas. And there have been reports in the press that more than 100 data centres have looked into or inquired about the availability of connections to the gas grid. And in fact, we've seen the government give the go-ahead to a development in Wapsies Wood near Beaconsfield to say, yes, you can apply into the new nationally significant infrastructure projects programme. And that is a data centre. Clearly, this is pre-application, so I don't want to overstate whether or not this is definitely going to happen, but that is a data centre that is saying we are not going to seek a grid connection, we are going to have 300 megawatts of on-site gas generation. And if that pattern starts to be replicated because data centres cannot connect quickly enough to the grid, then that provides even greater concern when it comes to emissions and our ability to reach net zero. And I would also add that that provides serious concerns in terms of local air quality, because it's one thing to be connecting to a grid if you're a 300 megawatt data centre. It's quite another to be burning that gas on site. And I think local residents who are coming to us at Global Action Plan are equally concerned about the potential of air quality impacts from gas generation, and also from the diesel backups. We've seen that as well.
Can I pick up on the gas point?
You can quickly, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
So Pure Data Centres Group, we actually operate an islanded gas solution in Dublin, but that's using biogas effectively. So that was run entirely carbon neutral last year, and there are sufficient quantities of biogas to, as it upgrades, to run it carbon neutrally. So there are opportunities to ensure that gas solutions are carbon neutral.
And again, might it be a sensible thing for this committee to suggest that where gas applications go in, that they should always be only approved if they are biogas then?
So yes, so the biogas functions, it gets injected into the grid, so it's not necessarily biogas being trucked to the place where the gas is being consumed, but that can work in the UK as well as in Dublin.
Jonathan Davies.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things that I'm surprised haven't come through in the discussion that we've had today with the various panels, and these questions are related to efficiency improvements to offset growth in data centre demand. But actually, the role of advanced modular reactors is a significant one. That technology is quite nascent at the moment, and I know some of the big data centre providers have engaged with the likes of Rolls-Royce regarding AMRs. I know because I used AI to tell me in this meeting. But if I might just ask you, Mr. Evans, perhaps you're well placed. What is the sector doing to communicate perhaps its willingness or the colour of its money to support the growth of that technology? Because sure, we can do efficiencies over time. Look at a car from 40 years ago is much less efficient to a modern one. But what is the sector doing to help move that technology along? Because it has applications well beyond what data centres can do.
So look, the sector is very interested in it. It is very interested in it because of the grid connection challenge that we have. And I should say, the grid connection challenge is not just the duration of the connection that you might face, which is often multiple years, but the uncertainty that within that grid connection system. So you can have significant slippages within that when you've already started to build out the infrastructure, where you've already probably let space in halls within that data center. So this is a big challenge for the sector. It's not just UK, I should also stress. So we are looking at things behind the meter in that private wire area. Small modular reactors is one of those. I think I'll
mean advanced modular reactors rather than small.
Well, I think there is both micro, small, and advanced modular reactors, as far as I'm aware. So I might be getting my technologies confused here, but if we sort of use the term small nuclear reactors, then I might just sort of blanket that across. Ultimately, I think those technologies are at least 5 to 6 years away, as far as I'm aware, not least with regulatory challenges and complying with the regulatory regime, which is very sensible. That is not a solution that is go live today in terms of when we are looking to build out over the next 4 to 5 years. It is interesting, I think, in terms of what that energy mix looks like beyond that point, and we are broadly supportive of having that energy mix because of the resilience that it can bring to the grid as a whole.
Are you able to sort of give us a sense of how much money the sector is stumping up to support the development of advanced modular reactors?
Well, I think just like how we have used power purchase agreements to incentivise renewable build, and there is a piece of research from Aurora Energy Research that estimates that power purchase agreements could bring on somewhere in the range of, or it could de-risk around 19 gigawatts of renewable energy sources over the next 10 years. The sector would be very interested in having similar power purchase agreements in place, or in co-locating build where that might make sense, so that you can more effectively use private wire. But it would be as an anchor tenant, because as the previous session heard, a lot of UK compute is cloud. That is steady state. There are obviously other forms of compute. We do not have sort of large frontier models being trained in the UK for high energy and copyright reasons, and that is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. Where you move to sort of inferencing and other fine-tuning of models, then those workloads have an element of flexibility in terms of both their location and the amount of load that you put on them. But broadly, it is a very good anchor tenant for some of these energy build-outs.
So on co-locating, so the government's stumped up £1 billion to support heat networks through the Heat Network Transformation Programme. How plugged in are you to the conversations around that? Or is it difficult to sort of bring the stakeholders together, because you've got DESNES, you've got local authorities, and they're not your usual stakeholders necessarily?
So it's not my absolute area of knowledge and insight, but certainly where we have convened some of our members around Old Oak Park Royal and others, there has been some government investment into that heat network itself. But that is an area, as Dawn mentioned, that is of significant interest to the data centre sector itself.
What about green hydrogen? Are those conversations happening? Because you talked about gas.
Yeah,
I know
again,
that still requires a huge amount of electricity to produce, but if we got to a stage where we were doing that with renewables like the Nordics are and supplementing it with nuclear, is that technology you could scale up for data centres?
I think as long as it meets climate commitments that the sector has, and there are really strong sort of climate commitments around the data centre sector that they have signed up to. And as long as the price point works for the sector as well, and I would say we already face a very high price point in the UK, we are open to a range of technology solutions. We've already talked a little bit about on-site generation. That is mostly for backup and used in extremis. Where it is tested, and the sector has mostly moved towards HVO and away from diesel. Often that testing can be a result of the permit requirements that those individual sites say. So it's actually the Environment Agency at times telling us to turn the generators on. But that is to make sure that they are working and compliant with the Environment Agency permits as well.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, we've got a national plan to decarbonise or largely decarbonise the grid on the energy that we use by 2030. This is going to be essentially new strain on the grid as the sector grows. But if I might come to you, Mr. Hayes, if efficiency gains in the data centres are slower than anticipated, how should government and regulators respond to prevent those data centre growth from placing unsustainable pressure on energy, water, and wider infrastructure systems?
Yeah, I think that's the nub of it really, and we have carbon budgets, and we have a carbon budget growth delivery plan which looks at how we'll meet up to the 6th carbon budget. But we know in the 7th carbon budget there is no specific reckoning with data centres, and all we're hearing from ministers is that the growth is inherently uncertain. And of course it is in one sense. We don't know exactly how many data centres there are going to be or how much demand there's going to be. But I think we urgently need two things. We need the national policy statement that was promised in November to be delivered within 3 months, and we still haven't got it. And that will set out how we look at cumulatively the planning applications that come through the NSIP process. And more, even on top of that, we need the government to look very carefully at how this growth will be absorbed within carbon budgets, because of course carbon budgets are technology neutral. They don't say you can only have this amount of wind or this amount of whatever. It's a budget. But But it is based in the reality of physics and emissions and the ceilings that we are committed to, and therefore if data centre growth is going to push up emissions, and the government decides that's what it wants to do, that's a legitimate choice, except it has to then show where the emissions are going to come down. And I think our concern at the moment is that with the kind of relaxation of planning rules and the express intention of the government to make it easier to build data centres here, there isn't a sense that somewhere else is being constrained in order to make it all add up and fit under the carbon budgets.
Surely one of the levers to mitigate the environmental impacts is to have better collaboration between the opportunities that can be created through the waste heat. I was a local councillor previously, a cabinet member. I was very keen to have a data centre at the swimming pool because we could use some revenue there to heat the swimming pool and provide a useful thing, but there was just no means of getting it off the ground.
Yeah, I think clearly, a number of data centres are going to be built, and we know that about 90% of the energy that goes into the data centres escapes as heat. Like, that is clear. So the best use possible of that heat is going to be a good thing, and lots of communities are interested in how that waste heat could be used to drive district heating networks, etc. But unfortunately, that is sometimes being used as a reason to advocate for the construction of a data centre, rather than looking at it, as I would suggest the government ought to, as kind of, okay, when they're built, this is how we must make best use of them. Like I say, we have a worrying lack of clarity about what the overall plan is. We also have a lack of clarity about who the end users are. And there has been a little bit of discussion about that, both in the previous panel and on this. But I think the industry would help itself if it was really transparent about who the ultimate end users of these data centres were, because in the planning applications we look at and the questions we ask, it's never disclosed. And for the local residents who are concerned about the construction of these data centres, that matters, because if the end user is going to be a university that's looking to crack an intractable medical problem, they will feel very differently about it than if it is generative AI that is at the benign end, just generating pointless videos, or at the more destructive end, doing some of the things that, for instance, we saw at the beginning of the year with Grok enabling the nudification of teens. So transparency from the industry is critically important, and asking those questions, I think, is an important job that the government can do. We did ask them, do you have a list of all of the clients of the data centres up and running? And they said no.
I'd love to explore this more, but I think the clock's against us now, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll bring Sarah Gibson in, and then we'll go to John Whitby.
A very quick question off the back of what you have all said about being able to use some of the waste heat and the difficulties that Dame Childs mentioned too with district heating. Is there a possibility that the government's initiative on expanding the mayoral authorities would allow, if they were given the authority and the capabilities or the power to be able to be seriously strategic, and I'm avoiding the word planning deliberately on the grounds that planning in this country means nothing in terms of what it would mean to a secular person, but actually strategic thinking, strategic initiatives to be able to do some of the things that Mr. Evans mentioned had been done around Old Oak?
Yes, definitely. So whenever we've had success in our conversations around district heating, it's because we've had the conversations at the local level, and that's about wanting to go in to be a good citizen effectively and sit well within the community. So where we have schemes that are going forward, so in Old Oak and the Brent scheme when it will eventually go forward, and in other European jurisdictions, it's because we've had the conversations at the local level.
Do you think the mayoral authorities model will help with that? Is that
potentially, but there's a timing piece as well, because these systems don't exist here. So being able to build them out sufficiently to enable the data centres to plug in, because the heating of swimming pools is lovely, but there aren't enough swimming pools, and it's quite small scale, to be candid. So if you're trying to offset larger scale facilities, it's not a sufficient use of the heat.
Sorry, Mr. Evans.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly come in. Sadiq Khan actually launched a quite significant report on data centres in London today, where he sort of reaffirmed his commitment for London to be a leading source of energy-friendly data centres. And I think that where we bring some of those development zones together, it's not sort of within London, it's actually being able to identify some areas where there is demand for data centres, and you can also start to think about what else you are building in that area. Then it starts to make it a lot easier to engage, as Dawn said, the different parts of the system to take best advantage of some of that heat offtake.
Thank you.
Very much. John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. Could just go back to the fact that we've heard lots of references to your backup at HVO today. I'm just a bit concerned it's being used frequently, and is that because the grid can't cope or for any reason?
And so it's not used frequently, it's only used in emergency, so when the grid fails, effectively. But what I would say is I think we're missing a little bit of a trick. So if we thought about all of the data centre standby power assets and our uninterruptible power supply, so our battery assets, if we were able to better use them for grid participation, and we have schemes that we've developed at Pure and at Enlighten for being a good grid citizen and participating in the grid, then you could add power in to the most constrained areas, think London, and avoid some of the over £1 billion of constraint costs that we currently have on the national grid here, where we're actually turning off the wonderful renewable power and turning on other potentially fossil-fueled power sources to stabilise the grid. So I think the use of standby power and the ability for data centres to have standby power should be seen as a very good addition that could be used more thoughtfully to better enable Clean Power 2030.
What's going to produce the lesser impact on the environment? Is it fabulous design for the building, or is it where the centre is sited?
It is both how the building is built, and as Dawn said, new data centres that are being built are the highest sort of BREEAM, I believe is how the acronym is pronounced, and LEED sort of standards, and that is sort of the standard that the data centre sector uses. But then it is about how effectively we use that, as we've already covered in terms of power and water. I should also say that sort of it's also then what that enables you to do. NESO have AI deployed from a UK data centre in their control centre. You probably wouldn't want that being deployed from outside the country. I think last year that saved them somewhere in the region of £25 million in grid balancing costs and several £100,000 in deferred carbon as well. So, it is also what the data centre then enables and allows us to do in other sectors to help them on their decarbonisation journey as well.
Okay. And how should the drive to accelerate development of data centres through AI growth zones be balanced against environmental constraints and local infrastructure capacity?
I think that AI growth zones are what they sound like. They are an attempt to generate greater capacity of AI and data centres in specific places, and we have also seen an attempt to kind of change the way that planning is pursued in those growth zones. So in Colham in Oxfordshire, it looks like the groundwork is being laid for again local development orders to be pursued. And I think I can see that the government's logic, if we want to streamline this process, if that's what the government is setting out to do, I would only caution that everywhere that major proposals are going in, local residents are getting very concerned and are feeling like they are not participating and not able to participate in that planning process and not able to have their voices heard, and that there is a sense that this is being done to them centrally and not involving them. And I think that is a big risk for government, and we've seen very similar approaches if we look back 10-15 years to the attempt to kind of get the fracking industry going in this country, I would say there are a lot of similarities there. That ultimately, local people didn't feel like this was for them, and it's been mentioned already. But the jobs benefits really don't seem to be what the developers are claiming. And the data centre I've mentioned already in Blyth, Northumberland, put lots of press releases out and repeated in local media that this would lead to 4,000 jobs, and the slightest bit of interrogation drew an admission that this would actually be 100 jobs. And this is a £10 billion investment in Blyth. It's enormous, which means you're getting one job for every £100 million. So I think there needs to be real interrogation of what this means for the people living in AI growth zones, and less of a kind of laissez-faire approach.
Yeah, I think just to briefly come in on that, I completely understand the government's intent here. We are in a moment in time in capital investment in data centre and compute build-out, right? The amount of capex being spent globally will not be the new normal. No one expects it to be. So it is, in our view, right for the government to try to capture as much of that in a sustainable way as possible. And we've seen significant capital investment announced over the last couple of years in the UK in compute infrastructure. I think on jobs, it is challenging in terms of, you can either say that the data centre employs the exact number of people that it employs, which is the sort of direct employment, or you can say it underpins the entirety of our digital economy, which is sort of everyone. It is quite hard to then sort of narrow that down to a sensible middle. Tech UK did a piece of work on this 2 years ago. We believe we employ about 44,500 people across the UK in the data centre sector. That is across all sort of 650 of those sites. They are well-paid jobs. This is highly technical, often high-voltage electrical engineers. All of those are above the UK median wage bracket. But an individual data centre will employ a relatively small number of people depending on its size. And if you're at the very edge of a data centre, it might employ no people, but it does underpin everything that we do in our lives ultimately.
And just to clarify on the jobs piece, if I cite our data centre in Brent, because that's a nice local example, that site is being built out over a number of years, so close to a decade. So when we say there are thousands of jobs in construction, that endures for nearly a decade in that local area. And yes, there are hundreds of jobs then in the data centre itself, which then endure for the longevity of the data centre, the entire lifetime of the data centre. But don't forget the halo effect that then has on the local community, because for every job that's in the data centre, we're using local supply chain. So that is amplified. So yes, you could sort of be reductionist and say that the construction jobs don't endure. When you're building out these facilities, that's over a decade of construction jobs in that local area. So I hear that it's probably not as compelling as putting in a factory, but the factories aren't coming. Those factories don't exist anymore. So rather a data centre that's adding to the community than something else, I would suggest.
And those growth zones, those clusters of data centres, is that where we should be deploying SMRs? I'll say SMRs.
Look, I think there is, the sector is not united in its view on AI growth zones, I think it is fair to say. And that is partly because where we currently deploy a lot of our data centres, it is location matters, even in the digital world. Latency matters for a lot of the compute that we are deploying in the UK, so that sort of storage piece. You ultimately want to actually be geographically close to your customer. If you're doing fine-tuning of models and things like that, that sort of relationship loosens as you go. Some AI growth zones, it's hard to understand where that customer demand is coming from, but they are largely in areas where the grid is less constrained. So there is logic to where they have gone, but it's about how do you then use that data center as more of a flywheel effect to stimulate some of that demand, stimulate the local sort of digital economy as well. And that does involve government sort of looking as a whole of government approach to make those a success.
Mr. Hayes, are there any environmental constraints that would rule out a site completely, regardless of mitigation.
Yeah, the best and most memorable acronym I've heard is Beyonce, which is bring your own new clean energy, which I like a lot. And I think that's of critical importance. I think we should be demanding of data centres that if you are going to be built in an AI growth zone or somewhere else, that you can demonstrate that you are able to pay for the construction of genuinely new additional clean energy that's near enough to be used by the site. It won't always be practical to build that on the plot itself, but near, so that we're not talking about somewhere at the other end of the country where actually those electrons cannot come through the grid. So it has to be new and additional. It has to be clean. And I would say, despite the example that was given around biomethane, whereas correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, that was biomethane. It was bought from Germany and injected into the
last year
grid.
it was all locally sourced.
Okay, forgive me. Well, as I understand it, there is only capacity in the UK for about 8 terawatt hours of biomethane, and that's the equivalent of one large data centre. So, and we know that biomethane requires an enormous amount of land for the crops to be grown. So, personally, I would rule that out. Global Action Plan, we would rule that out and say this does have to be genuinely new, additional clean energy. So, Beyonce is me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah Gibson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just picking up a little bit on the point that Mr. Hayes made about local communities feeling that these applications, especially now that they can be referred up very quickly because their strategic infrastructure is happening to them rather than with them. I mean, this is a general problem with development and the lack of transparency over our planning system. But in this case specifically, I mean, do you feel that at the moment some of the sort of voluntary sustainable commitments by operators is sufficient to try and make communities feel that they are getting that co-benefits from having the data centre? Or do we actually need a sort of regulatory framework that would require some more public engagement, some more public and community benefits that in such a way? I mean, some of our solar farms are starting to do a community benefit companies within part of their infrastructure, which is certainly changing the tide of how people feel about it. What else do you think, both regulatory and from the industry, I'll come on to you both afterwards, we should be doing?
Yeah, I think there is a lack of trust about the voluntary commitments that are coming through from developers, rightly or wrongly. That certainly the communities that reach out to us don't buy it, basically. And as we saw in the recent legal challenge around the Buckinghamshire data centre, we do now have the precedent set that voluntary commitments made by developers must actually be concrete and legally binding. And I think that will help. I think that will actually help developers, because then communities can see what's in an application and say, well, that has to happen. What's been promised there has to happen. So I think that's an important step forward. I will say that though we are still seeing plenty of applications where there are attempts to mitigate the environmental impact associated only with like the administrative offices of these data centres. So there is a strange definition that says regulated energy is actually only that associated with the kettle and the printer and the heating of the back office, and that the servers themselves count as unregulated energy, and that is clearly not something which is that when that meets the real world, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So I would again strongly encourage regulators to be transparent. Developers to be transparent in those applications and say, no, this is our total energy footprint. These are our associated emissions, and this is what we're going to do to mitigate them. And the final thing I would say is that that we have had slightly strange examples reported to us of for instance, in that Havering case I gave earlier, the developer saying to the local community when they were concerned about the heat coming off the data centre, well, don't worry, because you'll be able to grow aubergines and cucumbers with that excess heat. And that doesn't really meet the seriousness of the concerns of the local community. They are concerned about this enormous infrastructure and how it might change their local area. And so for developers to make slightly flippant remarks like that, I think is unhelpful. So I would urge developers to enter into it in good faith and be as transparent as possible and try to build trust. And again, be totally clear about who the end users are going to be and what they're going to be doing in that data centre, because I think that will help.
I presume they weren't actually offering to build the polytunnels for the cucumbers. It wasn't actually a serious scheme, I take it.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Oh, right. Can I ask either of you, because you're involved in those sort of schemes which do have these co-benefits and have been more successful than some of the ones that Mr. Hayes is suggesting, what further things do you think would help to make it a level playing field so that everybody is doing the kind of things that you have discussed?
And so, from a pure or enlightened perspective, more than comfortable if the voluntary schemes are made mandatory, because I think that's entirely reasonable. I think maybe some of the anomalies, and I can't speak for other developer schemes, but perhaps some of the anomalies and nuances that come through the current planning system is that the developer is only talking about the building that they are building. We can't possibly talk about our customers' use of the compute, so the power usage effectiveness, you are talking about the 0.2 or the 0.3 and not the 1. So that was my point around that I made earlier around looking at the improvements in efficiency of compute, and doesn't irrelevant of who the end customer is, that efficiency of compute is really mandated by the chipsets they put in, and the developer very rarely owns those. So some of the self-developed sites that the big tech companies are building for themselves, of course they can comment on that, but particularly if you're developing a site and you don't yet have an end customer, then you can't do that. And when a scheme goes through planning, we may not yet have had an end customer, because generally our customers need to know that the scheme is already consented and that you already have your power application. So at the point of planning, I couldn't possibly tell you who my end customer was, because I don't know. I could give you an example of, well, it's likely to be one of these 5, but I don't know which because I haven't sold it yet. So that might be where some of those anomalies are coming from.
And just very briefly, look, data centers largely are a new asset class, and particularly a new one in the public eye. So, it is on the sector to explain sort of what we do and what data centers enable. And sometimes I agree with Oliver. Actually, we haven't been a very good. We've been our own worst enemy sometimes when it comes to sort of explaining that. There are sometimes very good reasons why we can't say, and the data in this infrastructure build out is going to be used in the NHS, because it may well be that the NHS definitely doesn't want us to say that, or that the regulatory and resilience regimes that data center operate under forbid that as well, right? So for critical national infrastructure reasons, I think the sector really does want to work with local communities. Ultimately these are significant capital investments that are going to be there for a long time. They're going to be a part of that community for a long time. So really the sector does want to do that. It can at times be a bit of a challenge to engage with a variety of local community groups around some of this, but I think that is on the data center sector to do that better. Part of the challenge is we can't always say, come and have a look to see what the data center looks like. These are, as I said, critical national infrastructure. They are secure facilities. So it is sometimes hard to sort of make that happen and to demystify them at times. I think despite that, the best polling that I've seen on this shows, and it's not a huge margin at all, but that ultimately the public do support data center builds, both at a national and at a local level. There is a big don't know in that, but ultimately they do still favour that, and I think that was polling by Public First this year. And they do it for 3 reasons really, which is they think it's going to create jobs, they want to keep data in the UK, and it's going to allow opportunities for UK tech companies as well. So those are the top 3 reasons.
And people are always very keen on infrastructure as long as it's not in next to their own home, aren't
That
they?
did ask them actually
right.
in your locality. Now,
Right.
I will agree that
Yeah.
the majority did decrease slightly,
Yes.
but it was still a majority.
In terms of having sort of stronger regulatory offsets for local communities, you wouldn't think that that was a detrimental idea, in that some of the local authorities' abilities to insist on better communication and engagement at an early stage would in fact perhaps be beneficial to all.
And so I don't see a challenge with that. I do think there are some movements in the planning system which could be beneficial. So rather than the Section 106 stuff just going into a big black hole and you know, paying money, doing more meaningful things. So you know, our biochar facility and our decarbonisation platform through A Healthier Earth, maybe doing some meaningful things with that. Or, for example, around our London sites, we build urban forests. We work with the local communities and local schools. So doing meaningful things with the Section 106 funding, increasing the biodiversity in the local area, I think, you know, as a platform, Pure Data Centres Group are happy to participate in those things and make it more local rather than just giving money over that then doesn't necessarily see that community benefit in that local area.
Yeah, so to see a direct benefit from the data centre rather than just something disappearing into your cash-strapped local authority. Thank you, that's very helpful.
Well, Mr Hayes, Dame Childs and Mr Evans, thank you very much indeed for your evidence there. It's been an excellent first session and we're very grateful to all of you for your evidence that we've heard. So we'll bring this session to a close. With thanks, this sitting is suspended. Order.